Alright, let's talk about the books that I read this month. Let's kick it off with some nostalgic reads. I recently decided to carry on with my nostalgia series of reviews where I take old books that I read a very long time ago and read them and then do a kind of retrospective on the channel. And I decided to do that with one of my favourite childhood series, Harry Potter. This month I managed to finish The Philosopher's Stone and I'm about halfway through The Chamber of Secrets, but I'm taking my time with it. I'm reading a chapter every other day because there are other things that I want to read. Obviously everyone knows the story of Harry Potter, the famous wizard, the boy who lived. I have to say I am definitely experiencing this very differently from how I experienced it as a child or teenager, which was when I last read it. In fact, I think the last time I read the series of back to front was when the 7th book came out, or around that time, so it really has been a while for me with this series. One thing that I do think has held up really well for me with Rowling's work is her imagination. Her world building is amazing. She just creates this sense of wonder and magic, and she does that, whether you're an adult or a child, so I commend her for that. Another thing that I really like is her sense of humour. I think she is really funny, and her characters sometimes remind me of sort of Dickensian characters, whether that's just the certain silly ways that they talk, or the names especially, like Daedalus Diggle, or Severus Snape, all these kinds of Dickensian names I really enjoy. Unfortunately, there are some things, especially in The Philosopher's Stone and The Chamber of Secrets as well, really, that let the books down a bit. I do think that there are one too many cliches in Rowling's work. For example, most of the villain characters, like Dudley and Crabbe and Goyle, just being, big fat bully types that stand there and go, ugh, that kind of thing is a bit cliche. Obviously you also have the idea of the chosen one, which is a big trope, but I don't really mind that too much if it's done reasonably well, which I think it is in the Harry Potter series, or at least my memory tells me that it is. We'll see going forward if I still hold that opinion by the end. I also think she relies a little bit too much on plot convenience, like in The Philosopher's Stone, how Harry happens upon the Mirror of Erised. He just sort of happens to stumble on it completely by chance, this big plot significant thing, and that happens a lot in Rowling's work, and it's something that you don't really notice when you're a kid reading this stuff. When you get older, you do. That being said, I'm enjoying the Harry Potter series so far. I will be doing more detailed reviews on it, and one thing that I will say now is that I do think that The Chamber of Secrets is a very underrated book. It was one when I was a kid that scared me a lot because of the whole snake stuff, and I do find it to be quite a dark, gothic sort of style of book in comparison to the first book, which is a bit more light-hearted, with some dark moments, of course, because you have Voldemort and the scene with the unicorn and all that. But I think that The Chamber of Secrets is quite a dark book, and I enjoy it, and I think I actually prefer it to The Philosopher's Stone, so that's something that I will talk about when I get into my reviews. Next, we have another reread for me, and that is Virginia Woolf's The Waves. The Waves is definitely my favourite of all Virginia Woolf's books that I've read. It tells the story of 6 principal characters, 3 boys, 3 girls, and it follows them from their early childhood all the way till they seem to be in reasonably old age. And it is just a fantastic exploration of these characters and their inner lives, and how their identities intersect with each other throughout their lives. It's a very difficult book to summarise because it doesn't really have a plot, it just kind of follows the lives of these characters. And at every kind of stage of the book, whenever there's a transition to the next stage of life, you have this scene of a kind of a pastoral scene of the sea crashing into the cliffs, and at different times of the day. And obviously the different times of the day represent the different time of life that our characters are at. I just think this is Virginia Woolf at her absolute peak. She just introduces 6 fantastic characters in this novel. She really digs deep into their mental lives. For example, all of them in the very first chapter, when they're children, have sort of triggering events that have impacts on them that will last for the rest of their lives. For example, one of the characters, Susan, she is kind of a homely girl. She cares about nature, and she's a bit more maternal than one of the other girls, Ginny, who's kind of vivacious and fun. And she catches Ginny kissing one of the boys, and she's jealous. And at that moment, she decides that her life is over, and she's going to retreat from the world. And she does this. She keeps this childhood event has such a big impact on her and how she develops as a character. And that's pretty much true from all of them as well. Another example is a character called Louis, who comes from a more lower middle class family. His dad runs businesses, and he's Australian, so he's seen as a bit of a kind of rough in comparison to the more middle class bougie kids that he's around. And from a very early age, he has it drilled into his head that he's never going to amount to anything like what these other kids are going to amount to because of his class background. And there are just loads of other things as well, loads of other cool characters, and definitely a book that's worth reading, and definitely one that's underrated within Virginia Woolf's own catalogue. You know, everyone talks about Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, Where's the Love for the Waves? I think it's definitely her best book. Also, I would say it's a very good book for the summer too. I actually decided after I listened to this on audiobook last year that the next time I would reread it, I would wait till the summer and sit outside with the book. And I don't know why, but I just sometimes, you know, it's nice to read a book in a certain setting. I like to read Wuthering Heights if it's in the middle of winter and it's dark, likewise with Dracula. But with this, I just think it does really well in a really summery, breezy atmosphere. And that's what I've been doing, and it's definitely added to my pleasure reading the book as well. Next up we have 2 Jane Austen novels. I'm listening to one, which is a reread, and I'm reading the other one physically. And I'm taking my time with both. First, I'll go with Mansfield Park. So I read Mansfield Park, the actual novel, and as I'm doing with my read-through of Austen's books, I'm reading it first and then I'm listening to it afterwards. And I'm finding this is really rewarding, because when I read Mansfield Park earlier this year, I struggled. It took me a while, maybe also just to do with being quite busy at the time, but it is just not the same, you know, it's not the typical Austen novel. It's not as funny. The protagonist, Fanny, is a lot more reserved and shy than characters like Elizabeth Bennet, and it's essentially a story of this shy, reserved woman resisting some pretty despicable characters who she comes into contact with. And I have to say, you know, when I first read the book, I could sort of see why it wasn't as regarded as her other books. But listening to this audiobook and knowing the plot now, I'm really engaging with it on another level. Some of the side characters, like Fanny's Aunt Norris, who is an insufferable, snobbish woman and a horrible hypocrite, but a hilarious character to read, is just being really brought to life by this narration. I'm also noticing the Crawfords, who are the brother and sister who come into Fanny's life, and these are the kind of corrupting forces. These characters are also just wonderfully corrupt. In fact, I would say that in every Jane Austen novel there seems to me to be at least one character, usually it's a man, where he's incredibly charming and he'll deceive one of the women, and the kind of heroine has to work out whether he's a devil or, you know, a wolf in disguise, or whether he's actually a nice guy. But in most other books I find that those characters, they tend to either be a bit flat in comparison to the Crawfords, or they just tend to be, by the end you don't feel as sorry for them. Whereas with Mansfield Park, I think the Crawfords, especially Mary Crawford, are just wonderful, charming people, and even though they're not very nice and they don't do very nice things, you are sort of charmed by them, and in some ways they're more entertaining than Fanny, because Fanny's just so quiet and reserved. So excellent characterization there. Also a word on Fanny herself as a character. She's certainly not going to appeal to the modern kind of feminist crowd who want the kind of Lizzie Bennets with the sharp wit and the tongue and the grit, but she does have a strong will of her own. She reminds me a lot of Lucy Snow from Charlotte Bronte's Villette. Both of them are these quiet, shy heroines who oftentimes are completely forgotten about by the people around them, who just see them as submissive and pathetic. But at the end of the story, she's able to stand up for herself and for what she believes in. And I like that kind of character, because you really don't get them in literature that much anymore. Usually everyone wants the kind of big, extroverted hero. So it's a nice change, especially with Austen's novels, to just get a different shade of character. And I think she does it just as well as she does her more extroverted ones too. As for Emma, this is a book that I think it's just something about Austen. She's really, in a sense, she's quite difficult to read. And so I'm doing my first read through of Emma. I've not got to the audiobook bit yet. And again, it's taking me a while to get through it. I think I'm about 2/3 of the way through. Emma obviously tells the story of Emma. There is a girl who is a bit full of herself. She thinks she's a bit of a matchmaker, and she tries to matchmake and often makes terrible decisions while doing it, because she thinks her powers of judgment are a little bit better than they actually are. It is definitely a funny book, and one thing that I've noticed in comparison to, say, Mansfield Park, and actually the earlier books, and what I like about it, is that it really does focus in on the protagonist. And obviously the book, it gives its name, Emma, so you kind of would expect this. But one thing that I would say I would criticise earlier books of Austen for are, she often tries to focus on too many characters sometimes, and that can mean that some don't get as much development as others. And one thing that Austen has started to do in her later books is really focus in on characters, and in particular their internal monologues. And you do get these monologues, you know, in earlier books, but just the depth that she's going to in this book and the way that she's exploring Emma as a character and the way that she's developing throughout the course of this book is really impressive. As I said though, I am struggling through it. I think it's just the oldie time language, so I'm sure that when I come to reading this again or listening to this after I've read it, I will see a load more in, and I will definitely be talking about it on the channel because I'm really enjoying my reads of the Austen books, even if it's a little bit difficult at times. Next we have some poetry, which again is a reread. I am rereading Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. This is the first edition. I picked this for a book club, and I picked the first edition just because it's a little bit slimmer. And as I have said in the past, I absolutely adore Walt Whitman, and like with The Waves, it's poetry that I'm reading outside on the grass, as Whitman I'm sure would have wanted, and it just really is amazing poetry, and in my mind probably some of the best poetry that I will ever read. I just like how Walt Whitman touches on these themes of nature and embracing everyone, and it's all very kind of, you know, hippie in 1960s and in its feel like that. It's all about expanding and opening yourself up and not just, you know, putting yourself in this kind of box, which is a message that I think is really important today when I feel like everyone is kind of separated off from each other. And so to read this poet who is just so expansive and trying to encompass everything that he can in his poems, I think is just fascinating. Also the way he writes about nature and the importance of being in contact with nature and not just kind of, you know, locking yourself up. All of his themes are just exactly, you know, they're right up my alley. I also like his style of poetry. It's not traditional in any sense. It's more like listening to someone give a sermon, and the way that he pulls the reader into the poems as well. He's always addressing you, and he's, you know, pulling you into his poem, and sometimes even pulling you into the action of his poetry. And I just find that fascinating, that you're really engaging with the poet in Leaves of Grass. So I think it's a wonderful collection, and it's difficult to articulate everything that I feel about these poems, but it is something that I think if I ever do get into poetry and I know enough, I might dig deeper into his poems on some videos in the future. But yeah, I would definitely recommend Leaves of Grass, and I would definitely recommend reading it in the grass in this, at least in the UK at the minute, very beautiful summer. And last but not least, we have another new book that I'm reading, and that is Dickens' his first novel, The Pickwick Papers. The Pickwick Papers follows the exploits of the Pickwickians, who are a club of several gentlemen led by Mr. Pickwick, who is a rather ridiculous man. I think they kind of hunt artifacts, and they're kind of just silly. And basically, it's not a novel in any traditional sense. It's more like an episodic thing where they go on adventures and usually cause a lot of trouble, and that's essentially what it is. It reminds me a little bit of Don Quixote in that sense. You have Pickwick, who is, you know, this larger-than-life character, a little bit self-delusional, and he's kind of followed by his manservant Sam, who is more like the Sancho Panza character, who's a bit more sensible than his master is. And they go on their various adventures and get up into all kinds of mischief. I have to say, this is part of my decision to read Dickens out loud, so this is taking me a long time. I've almost finished volume 1 now of the 2-volume set that I've got, so it's going to be a while, I think, before I get to the end of the Pickwick Papers. But I am enjoying it. I did struggle at the beginning. I think one issue with the Pickwick Papers is you can definitely tell Dickens is still not quite fully realised as a writer. A lot of his side characters are very, very rough. Some of them are just called, you know, they're just called like, you know, the bearded gentleman, or the, you know, the lady with the gargling voice, or something like that. And while that can be funny sometimes, it can also be quite confusing, and also just kind of difficult to read over and over again. I also find his sentences to be sometimes a little bit long-winded, which is, you know, just a broad thing about Dickens, but I think in his later works he's able to do that kind of rambling style, but in a way that's a bit more engaging and entertaining, and also he has better characters to back it up. That said, now that I'm about halfway through, I am finding that he is starting to develop his principal characters. The relationship between Mr. Pickwick and Sam, for example, is a fantastic relationship and really is the heart of the story. Another thing that I really like about this book is that it intersperses these, you know, the kind of main narrative of them traveling around and doing all the things that they do, with these little stories like tales. Other characters will come in to the narrative and they'll tell some kind of tale. And what's interesting is that these tales are often quite gothic and dark. They're like ghost stories, some of them, for example. And I find it interesting that the kind of main story is this light romp kind of thing, but then they're interspersed with these kind of spooky folk tales, and it just adds a really nice kind of duality to the Pickwick Papers. One of them especially, I can't remember the exact details now, but it's a story of a man and a woman. He ends up in a debtor's prison, or both of them do perhaps. The wife ends up dying because of poverty, and her son, they have a son who also dies. He dies first, and she dies afterwards. And they do this because this girl's uncle, I believe, basically just lets them starve to death, and because he doesn't care. And then you just have this terrifying story of this father who's hell-bent on revenge on this man for what he's lost. And one day this man finds himself in debt, and he ends up on the brink of going to debtor's prison, and he runs away, and the gentleman follows him to where he is. He's like washed up in some horrible place, and he goes and sees him in his room and basically says, you know, you're gonna hang for running away or whatever, and the old guy just dies from fear. It's a really gothic, terrifying story, and one of the highlights of the book for me are these little tales, especially that one. It's definitely worth a read. Like I say, it's definitely, you know, you can definitely tell Dickens is not quite there as a writer, but there's still a lot of interesting things going on in the Pickwick Papers too. Alright, that is it for all the books that I have been reading, or currently reading, this month. Maybe next month I might have finished a couple of them, who knows. Let me know what you've been reading this month, and let me know what you think of any of the books that I've talked about as well, down in the comments. And that's it for this video, so take care everyone. Ta-ra!